Atari,
Hi, and welcome to another episode from Retronaut. So, this is the third part of our Apple II story. And in our last episode, we looked at the enhancements that Apple released into the 2 years after the launch of the Apple II. And we looked at how those enhancements eventually led to the first new model of Apple II, which was the Apple II Plus, which was released in 1979. Over the next 3 years, though, nothing much really of note came out from Apple. And that's odd because this was its much-loved machine, and this was because it had a secret project going on. Behind the scenes at Apple, they were working on the successor to the Apple II, the Apple III. But fate was not going to be kind to this machine because, once again, it seems that Steve Jobs had intervened in its design and he had forbidden any active cooling inside the machine, including actually some vents as well to let the air out, which seems quite bizarre. So yeah, what did that machine do? Well, it ran incredibly hot, and apparently it was so unreliable that soon the new machine was something of a zombie. I mean, technically it was alive, but really was dead, and it took a couple of years before it actually did die off, and eventually Apple did pull the plug on it. They did realize that they had obviously developed some technology, some new technology that they really had to do something with, so they decided to put that into enhancing their original Apple II model. Because of this, in a couple of years, they actually released a new model of the Apple II called the Apple IIe. And this very much enhanced Apple II injected some much needed revenue into the company. It also brought along some new customers, as well as obviously making existing customers happy by advancing on the Apple II line of computers. Now, in truth, it turns out that the Apple II was actually the lifeblood of Apple in all the way pretty much through the 1980s, even after the Macintosh was launched, because it had a relatively slow uptake by users. The Apple II had a relatively high price, but it also had a very loyal user base. So it proved to be a pot of gold that really bankrolled all of the sort of hidden projects that Apple had going on in the early 1980s. So yeah, the Apple II was definitely a battler, and it wouldn't go down with a fight. It wouldn't be replaced easily. But of course, Apple did have some plans up its sleeve. So let's find out what happened next in the evolving story of the Apple II. By 1984, the Apple IIe was selling well, but Apple wanted to develop a new form factor to help them sell their star machine into the business market. Many business users, they quite simply didn't want to have a machine with expansion ports in it. They just wanted a machine that they could plug in and start working on straight away. They didn't want to go fiddling around inside and putting cards in and all that kind of stuff. I know, weird, right? So the Apple IIe's enhancements, they were a pretty good start, and it pretty much included everything. But there did remain some things which were not standard. For instance, the serial ports, which you would need for printing or using a modem, you had to get an expansion card for those. So Apple must have thought if they could simplify the II even further and remove some expansion cards and integrate them, then maybe they could make a kind of portable machine, and one that was aimed much more for the business market. So a business user, for instance, could use that machine during the day, and then in the evenings they could take it home and do some work at home, or maybe, do some adventuring in Zork or Suspect or something like that. And it was from this idea that the Apple IIc was born. So on April the 24th, 1984, Apple released its most adventurous update to the Apple II series. This is the Apple IIc. So the C in its name stands for compact, and I certainly think that if you look at the machine here, that it actually lives up to its name. I think you can almost consider it one of the first actual viable portable microcomputers. It's not really a laptop, but it actually is portable. I also think it's one of the best looking machines of the 1980s, and indeed it's something of a glimpse of the future micro design, at least at Apple anyway. It sold for an initial price of $1,295, which is roughly $6,674 in 2024. And you may be familiar with this number because if there's one thing you can say about Apple, they were very, very consistent with their pricing, which was expensive. It's a pretty massive departure from the original large box design, of course, because in this Apple II, for the first time, they've actually dropped one of its key defining characteristics. It doesn't have any of the internal expansion slots. Obviously, because of the very compact case, it couldn't fit them. So let's have a look at the Apple IIc's defining characteristics. So for the first time, they stopped using the 6502 processor and instead changed it to a MOS 65C02. This was an evolution of the 6502. It added 27 new instructions to its code set for coders to make use of. This change actually then meant that the machine could only claim 90 to 95% compatibility with existing Apple II software, so a bit of a trade-off there. This was the first Apple II where you actually got a disk drive as standard, and I'll show that to you here on the side. It featured an internal 5¼ floppy disk drive, which was another first for an Apple II machine. For the first time you had not only a drive as standard, but it was actually an internal drive. The internal expansion slots had to be dropped because of its form factor. Well, I say they were dropped, but in reality they were actually kind of virtualized in internal electronics. And what this meant was, if you wanted to actually address one of the original slots, there was actually hardware there which emulated that equipment. So you could actually address a slot and it would act as if that particular expansion card was in that slot and react accordingly. To compensate for the removal of the expansion slots, pretty much everything that was additional in the Apple IIe was now standard with an Apple IIc. It had the equivalent of 5 expansion cards built into the logic board. So let's have a look at what these were. So firstly, it has a mouse card, which was connected via the joystick port on the rear of the machine, which you can see here. This port now doubled as a joystick and a mouse port, allowing you to use the same mice which had been released for the Apple IIe and also Macintosh computers. Now, 2 super serial cards were included, and these manifested themselves as serial ports on the rear of the machine. On the left-hand side is a port for connecting a modem to, and on the other side of the rear of the case, you have a port for connecting your printer. I'm not really sure, to be honest, if these 2 ports are actually interchangeable, or they are intended only for a printer and modem respectively. Maybe somebody who's watching this can let us know. It also had an extended 80-column card, and what that meant was you had 40 and 80-column support as standard in the machine. It also came with the 64K that would have been on that card, so that meant that the IIc came with 128K of RAM as standard, which was really a welcome boost for business users. In terms of RAM, the IIc had another card up its sleeve. It had bank switching, which was introduced from the Apple III, but this had been enhanced, so now the machine could actually address up to 1 MB of RAM. And that really is quite impressive for an 8-bit machine, I've got to say. And as I said earlier, it has a 5¼ floppy, and to get that, it had to have a Disk2 floppy card internally. So, as I said, this was used to connect the 5¼ drive, which was built in, but it also manifested on the back of the machine as a second port for another disk drive. Now, this port was special, and Apple actually marketed it as a smart port. It had extra capabilities that meant you could actually attach a hard disk to it. Because it was based on a floppy disk controller, these hard drives were not particularly fast, but they did actually work. And you can kind of see that this came from the same kind of lineage as the SASE drive controller, which was also based on a floppy controller. But as I said, these drives were fully formed, and it did allow you to have a hard disk on an Apple IIc. Beyond these virtual expansion cards, there was an expansion port on its rear, which was labelled as an RGB monitor port. In truth, this port needed some kind of extra hardware plugged into it, some kind of device to interpret its non-standard signals to actually work with a monitor. But Apple did actually release an RF modulator for it, and also a connector which allowed the Apple IIc to work with an LCD display, which would have, I suppose, made it into basically a sort of laptop, I suppose. So yeah, maybe this was really one of the sort of first laptop sort of form factor machines. The IIc also updated the IIe ROM somewhat, fixing some bugs and also adding enhancement to AppleSoft Basic, giving it better lowercase and 80-column support. And I also have to assume that there were also numerous other additions to make all the changes in this new machine work. The IIc, for instance, introduces 25 new characters on its ROM, and these were introduced to allow you to make a GUI. When this was combined with a mouse, you could actually then have a machine that had a GUI for the first time. So that was actually really cool, that it actually supported a graphical user interface with a mouse as standard, although it didn't actually come with the GUI. I hope that makes sense. Top left of the keyboard, there are 2 toggle switches. One of them toggles between 40 and 80 column mode, whilst the other one toggles between a standard US keyboard or a Dvorak or an international keyboard layout. And most obvious of all the new features, the Apple IIc also sported a new design language. This was created at Apple by the designer Harmut Esslinger. This new styling was intended to be used on 8 new projects that Apple had been working on. Earlier on in those projects, there were only 7 of them, and the management had taken to naming these projects after the dwarves from Snow White. And so the new design language was called Snow White. To go along with this new design, the IIc also sported a much lighter plastic on its case, which Apple called Fog. This new colouring and the Snow White design language was used for all of the peripherals that were released for the Apple IIc. Whilst the design language also went on to define the machines that were released by Apple for the next 10 years. Now, an interesting side note about the Apple IIc was that because the ROM changes introduced by it were attractive to Apple IIe owners, they asked for it to be released for the Apple IIe. They wanted to have the GUI characters and the mouse support. So, to accommodate this, Apple packaged up the 65C02 processor and the IIc's ROMs, and they sold these as a package that you could then install in your Apple IIe. This meant that users could buy this package, or dealers, and then they could put that into a IIe to gain the same sort of features as the IIc had. These Apple IIes were called Enhanced IIes, which is a little bit funny because the E in the IIe stands for Enhanced. So these were enhanced Apple IIs. So it just goes to show you can never really enhance your Apple II enough, can you? I've got to say, I really think the IIc is a beautiful machine. And I don't often call computers cute, but I think it is. I think it's definitely a cute machine. Having used one, I'm not really that much of a big fan of the monitor, and that's mainly because I've got a problem with my neck, and I'm a pretty tall person. As a result, the monitor is a little bit too low for me. You can see it's way below my eye line. And it's also quite a small screen as well. It's only a 13-inch screen. But on the flip side, it's a green screen monitor, and when you're using it, you really do feel like you're back in the 1980s. It's actually a good quality monitor. It's very sharp. I think together with the machine itself, it makes a fantastic unit. So I was really happy when I was able to buy this IIc along with a monitor. So yeah, I think it's a great machine, and I'm really looking forward to using it a lot more in the future. Now, before I go on, I just want to quickly show you just how portable this machine is and how Apple put a lot of effort into it. It actually has a carry handle on the back. You can see that there. And it also sort of doubles as a standing handle as well, which means you get a much more ergonomic slant to the keyboard when you're typing. As you can see here, it's not flat. Obviously, though, its main purpose is it's actually a carry handle, and I'm carrying this without too much stress. But I must admit, you wouldn't want to obviously trot along the street in Cupertino with this, unless you were trying to show off. I mean, laptop owners, they never show off, do they? No, never. But what you could do is you could actually buy a carry case for it. And I saw this during COVID when I was on my buying spree. And it's actually an original Apple IIc carry case. It has a space in it over here for the power supply. You put the machine here, and you can also put a monitor cable. Obviously, you can't carry the monitor with you. The monitor actually does have a carry handle here, which is pretty cool. But yeah, you're not going to walk along the street with this. I'm assuming that what they expected people to do was to buy 2 monitors, one for home, one for the office, and then put their machine into this every day and then take it back home. If it was me, I would have actually left the power supply in work as well and just taken the machine with me back home. You know, obviously some floppy disks as well. But yeah, it's really cool. Why did I get this? Well, it was because I needed something to store my Apple IIc in. And I thought, what better than the actual official carry case, which was intended for the machine. I do have the strap for it, it's inside. But obviously when I'm using it for storage, I don't really want the strap sort of catching on things. So yeah, it's definitely a little portable machine, and I just thought I'd share that with you. Anyway, back on with the video. So let's jump ahead 2 years now. We're now into the second half of the 1980s. The Atari ST and the Amiga had both been released in the middle of 1985, so we're already into the era of the consumer 16-bit machines. And what this meant was that the Apple II was now officially a previous generation computer. It was an 8-bit computer. Obviously, Apple had to do something about this. In September of 1986, Apple then went on to release a new Apple II machine, which, although it was presented as an Apple II, it was in fact something of a sea change for the platform. This new model was called the Apple IIgs. In this machine, the GS stood for Graphics and Sound. Although I honestly think they should have called it the NG. That would have stood for Next Generation, because basically that's what it was. Obviously it did have better sound and it did have better audio, as we'll go into, but it really was much more than better sound and audio. So yeah, I called this machine a sea change, and I called it that for a good reason. The IIgs sports a wholly new 16-bit architecture, and in that architecture, its CPU is a WD-C65C816, which is an evolution of the 6502 processor, and also a really hard name to say. So this processor runs at 2.8 MHz, and it's significantly faster than the IIe or the IIc. I think it's roughly twice as fast. In terms of RAM, the IIgs gets 256K as standard when it's launched, and I believe it was also expandable up to 1 MB. I have to say, by 1986, I honestly think 256K is a little bit paltry, especially for a next generation machine. But I suppose if you think about it, the Amiga when it came out had, what was it, 512K? But very quickly you had to expand that machine up to 1 MB because it obviously had a graphical user interface and it just needed a lot more RAM. Now, when the IIgs was launched, it actually didn't have a GUI. It still used ProDos. And I suppose because of that, you could probably say that it didn't need quite as much RAM because it didn't need all the extra memory for all the graphical stuff that was going on. But obviously, at the same time, that made it look quite old-fashioned, I suppose, compared to the ST and the Amiga, which were cheaper machines. But another issue was that the processor being 16-bit, the machine actually could be expanded to 1 MB, and it also had a 8 MB limit, which was obviously standard for a base 16-bit machine. Along with the new CPU and the RAM, it also had a new graphics processor, which Apple called the Video Graphics Chip, or VGC. And this chip, a bit like the chip, for instance, in the Amiga and the ST, gave it higher resolutions than the original Apple II. Higher resolutions and obviously greater color depth. It also sported an extremely capable sound chip, the Ensoniq 5503 digital oscillator chip. This was designed by Bob Yanez, and he was the guy who actually designed the original SID chip for the Commodore 64, so quite a pedigree, I suppose. And by this point, Bob had actually got his own company, Ensoniq, and this chip had actually been designed for use in a full-size synthesizer, so it really was extremely capable. Of course, for the first time, this was the first chip in an Apple II machine. Up until now, if you'll remember, Apple IIs had actually made do with beep sound, which was, you know, by 1986, extremely sort of rudimentary. Pretty much the same kind of sound experience that you would have had in a ZX Spectrum, which was a much, much cheaper machine. You know, on top of that, a lot of the sound processing had to be done by the CPU. So it was about time, really, that the Apple II actually got its own sound chip. Why is this even called an Apple II? Because it's a new processor, it's a 16-bit processor, it can't actually run Apple II software natively. So it seems a bit strange that they called it an Apple II. Well, because although this is more akin to an Atari or an Amiga, it did actually have a special card up its sleeve. If we were to look at, say, for instance, the Amiga, it can't run Commodore 64 software, it can't run Commodore 128 software. It's completely incompatible with those previous machines. And it's the same story for the Atari ST. It can't run 8-bit Atari machine software. So what did they do with the IIgs that was different? What they actually did was they created a new chip called a Mega 2, and this fitted inside the machine. I'll actually show it to you here on the logic board. And this Mega 2 chip was basically a complete Apple II on a chip. Now, the only thing that this chip didn't have was the CPU. It didn't have any RAM and it didn't have any ROMs. But what it did is it actually used the processing power of the IIgs, and it used the ROMs on the IIgs, and it used the RAM. And it ran the CPU in a special emulation mode that made it completely compatible with the 6502, which meant you had a complete Apple IIe in hardware inside this machine. And what that meant was you could actually then boot up the machine and it would then run in Apple IIe mode, and you could use an Apple II software on it, and it would actually natively run at twice the speed because, as I said, the CPU runs at twice the speed as the 6502. However, it did also have the ability to run at a slower rate, so this machine could actually run at the same speed as an Apple IIe. So the Mega chip combined with the CPU, as I said, and the RAM and the ROMs, gave this machine complete compatibility. And I think that's a really amazing sort of engineering feat that they did there. And it's kind of reminiscent of something that Woz would have done. Another thing as well, which was amazing, was that this machine had expansion slots in it, just like the Apple IIe. They were trying to get back to the original Apple II experience of being able to expand your machine. And in fact, they're actually 8-bit slots, exactly the same as you would have in an Apple IIe. Now, the downside with that was that it couldn't run anything in the expansion slots at the full 16-bit speed of the machine. But on the plus side, any expansion card for the Apple II, as far as I understand it, could actually work in this machine. You know, it's amazing actually what they did to actually get this machine to be a sort of hybrid between an Apple II and this new machine with a 16-bit processor. I'm really not sure how well that worked in practice, but I think it's a really interesting experiment that they actually tried there. Unfortunately, in this video, I don't really have enough time to go into a great deal of depth on this machine. And that's because I think it's pretty fascinating and there's just a huge amount of stuff to cover. It's basically a completely new machine in the range. But I would like to come back to this machine in the future, and definitely in the future. And the thing is as well, which is a funny thing about this machine, is I was very much aware of the Amiga back in the day and the Atari ST, but I had no idea whatsoever that this machine existed. As I said, over here in the UK, the Apple II range just sort of sailed us by, unfortunately. So when the Apple II came into my view, when I started watching retro videos, I then found out about the Apple IIgs, and I thought it was a really fascinating machine. One of the things I would say that is a little bit odd about this machine is that when it was first launched, it only had ProDos. So it was basically a text-based machine. There was no GUI. And that was very much unlike the Amiga and the Atari ST, which I used, and they were pretty capable, those user interfaces. Yeah, that is really odd by 1986, you know, that it would come out and after the original Amiga, which had a GUI, and it was really competing, I think, with an Amiga at this point in terms of capabilities. So it's very strange that they didn't actually get a GUI with it when it came out. And I think that kind of shows that maybe as a project, it wasn't really given the resources that it needed. But anyway, I think that's a story for another day where we'll go into a lot of depth about this machine. They did eventually get a graphical user interface. A couple of years later, Apple did actually release a GUI for it called GSOS. And I believe that's based on some of the work that they'd done on the Apple III. One of the downside of using that GUI was that the machine did need a lot more RAM. And I've actually used this machine with GSOS. And one of the things that I had to do when I got this machine was that it was actually quite a base model of GS. And I actually think it is a Woz edition machine. I don't know if you can see on the front, there was a special edition which had Wozniak's name screen printed on it. Now it's actually pretty much worn away on this one. But because of how sort of low end it was, I have to assume that it was one of the early machines that was released. But you can upgrade these with more RAM. And when you've done that, you can actually install GSOS and a hard drive, for instance. And that's when this machine really starts to shine, really starts to feel like a big leap forward, next generation machine. And yeah, definitely much more reminiscent of an Amiga or an ST at that point. It would have been in the fight, really. It just, I think maybe that came along a little bit too late. But anyway, like I said, we can't really talk about this too much. We kind of have to move on. But definitely, this is a machine I'm going to return to in the future because I think it's a bit of a star. So at this point, in 1986, with the release of the Apple IIgs, we really have the trinity of the Apple IIs complete. There were lots of different models that came along for the Apple, well, there were a few more for the Apple IIc. There were variations which were released for the IIgs as well. It didn't, just stay fixed like this. And definitely the Apple IIe also had some life in it yet. But we have the three main variations. In the center, we've got the Apple IIe. This is the kind of ultimate expression of the original Apple II that was released in 1977. If you actually saw it, you could pretty much mistake it really for the original machine once you got the ventilation slats in it anyway. It's pretty much the same appearance. Obviously, it has a lot of extensions in it by this point. Many of the features that were developed in the late 70s and some more obviously in the early 80s. And then obviously the legacy of the Apple III went into this machine. So by this point in 1986, you had the option of obviously having the sort of granddaddy model, the Apple IIe. Then, of course, you got the Apple IIc. Completely different kettle of fish, really. Aimed much more at the business market. Obviously, one of the things you do miss out on this machine is the lack of expandability as you have in the Apple IIe. But by this point, this machine actually had a lot of stuff built in, pretty much all of the stuff that you would really need for a fully fledged out machine, really. So not a bad option for a business user, definitely. The fact that it's kind of portable, you know, has a little carry handle on the back. If you had the power supply in an office and if you had two of these monitors, you could actually carry the machine itself back and forth between work and home, which is pretty cool. So not really a laptop, but definitely a portable machine. And Apple sort of capitalized on this in the launch, showing like a carry case and things like that. So yeah, the Apple IIc, a really nice machine, and one which actually pioneered, you know, the design language which went on to define Apple for another 10 years. So yeah, quite an important machine in some ways in Apple, in that they used this as a basis of trying out the Snow White design language, which I think produced a really beautiful looking machine. Talking good lookers, we've got the Apple IIgs, a really interesting machine. I think honestly, by the time that it came out, maybe a little bit too late, really. And especially some of the features were a little bit underwhelming, especially when you think about what was happening with the Atari ST and the Amiga by this point in Europe as well. You know, the Amiga was a massive hit, not so much in America as I understand it. But by this point, you would have had machines that would have had 1 megabyte pretty much as standard, I suppose, by 1986. Well, actually, no, that was 87 because the Amiga 500 came out then. But by that point, 1 megabyte really quickly became a standard. So when you think about this machine coming out with 256K, it's really underwhelming, really, for 1986. And especially when you think about the cost of this machine. But it's a really cool architecture. And I think if it had had the right processor in it, then it could have actually competed really well. But it was hampered by a processor that was actually too slow, really, for the time. And it was a bit of a weird decision why Apple did that. And we'll talk about that in another video. There are certain conspiracy theories that go around about it kind of being hobbled to stop it competing with the Macintosh, but we'll discuss that in another video. I think it's a great machine, especially when you get a little bit later in its life and actually gets a GUI. Definitely one worth checking out. And when I saw one of these come on the market in the UK, I snapped it up because I think it's the ultimate expression of these machines that you see here. It's got an Apple IIe inside it, bizarrely, on that Mega 2 chip, which I think is a really cool solution to actually getting Apple IIe software running on it, you know, the original Apple software. Actually, I think it runs software all the way back to 1977. So yeah, quite amazing that they did that. But obviously that would have put the costs up, but it would have got you backwards compatibility with all of the software that you already had for your Apple II. So I understand why they did it. It was actually quite a cool thing to do that they did that. And don't forget, obviously, that when you don't tune down the process, if you put it into Apple IIe mode, it would actually run twice as fast as this machine. So if you did want to run some kind of business software that was written for this machine originally, it would actually at least run twice as fast. So yeah, that is the Apple II Trinity. So what we're going to find out next is what happened after the 2GS's release, because there was actually some life left in the Apple family. So yeah, let's have a look at what happened next. 1 year after the IIc was launched, Apple decided to roll out a very small upgrade to the IIe. This was called the Apple IIe Enhanced, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. It was simply the IIe, as you can see here, with the Apple IIc CPU and ROM upgrade installed at the factory. To show that a model was actually enhanced, there were two things that you could see. Number one was there would be a sticker placed here, which actually read enhanced on it. And also when you booted up the machine, instead of the original Apple II text, which was displayed on the title screen, it showed Apple II/E. Now, the reason why people wanted to have this upgrade was because, as with the IIc ROMs and the CPU, it fixed a number of issues, but it also introduced a new character set which allowed the machine to display a GUI interface along with when you use a mouse. So to get those benefits, people upgraded their machines. And I suppose you can think of this as a kind of Me Too upgrade, really. People were seeing these extra features in the IIc and they wanted them for their IIe, so this is how they got it. So many people obviously bought the official Apple upgrade kit, and others with a little bit less money or scruples went out and bought a 65 CO2 themselves and then saw some bootleg ROMs and then installed it themselves. Now, if you want to upgrade your Apple IIe these days, that's actually what you have to do. You can't obviously go off and get an official Apple upgrade because they haven't made those for a very long time. This machine here is actually an Apple IIe Enhanced. I haven't put the sticker here, although I did receive it with a kit that I bought. But if I show you inside, you can see that there are a couple of ROMs there which have labels on. Those are the ROMs which were replaced. And you can see that in this machine, the CPU is actually the 65C02 rather than the original 6502. So this is actually an enhanced machine. All I need to do to get it to work with the GUI software is to buy an Apple mouse card, and then that would allow me to use the Apple mouse. And then obviously some software. So at some point, I will actually try and do that with this machine. That was why I actually upgraded it to take it up to the same level as an Apple IIc. So yeah, this is actually an Apple IIe Enhanced. So just 1 year after the Apple IIgs was launched, Apple gave its sibling, the IIe here, a slight buff. So a new Apple IIe was released in January of 1987. It's really more of an attempt to roll some of the changes that you would have seen in the Apple IIc into an official release of the machine, to change the design slightly, and also to modernize other aspects of the machine as well. So this particular model doesn't actually have any change to its name. There are some cosmetic differences, though, that you will actually notice if I show you the case. That does set it apart from the previous model of the IIe. The color of the plastic was changed from a beige, which was the traditional color, to become more of a sort of gray color. And it's because of this is why the machine became known as the Apple IIe Platinum. It's a sort of unofficial name, as far as I understand it, that was given to it by its users. Another thing that actually went was the traditional Apple II logo that you can see here, which is actually two recessed areas with the Apple logo and then the IIe logo. And that was replaced with a screen printed logo on a flush surface. And they also changed the typeface on that logo to use Garamond. And I believe that was the typeface used on the Macintoshes. At least I remember it being used in a lot of the indentation. So I guess that was to try and bring it more in line with the sort of modern styling of the Macintosh range. The Apple logo was also moved from here and it was placed over here in a little indented area over here. So yeah, a little bit of a sort of design refresh there, I suppose. The keyboard layout was changed, and that was to make it match more closely the IIc's keyboard. And it also added a separate numeric keypad here, which was actually something that the IIc didn't have. So in fact, it was a slightly better keyboard than the IIc, obviously possible because of the larger size of the machine. The original open and closed Apple keys, they were moved. At least the closed Apple was removed, and instead an option key was actually placed over here. And that brings it almost in line with the sort of modern Apple keyboards. So yeah, a little bit of an evolution there of the keyboard layout. It came with the 80 column card pre-installed. Obviously that would give you 40 and 80 column support, just like the Apple IIc. And along with that card, of course, there's the 64K of memory, which meant that the Apple IIe now came with 128K, as it did with the Apple IIc as well. Yeah, really a little bit again of a sort of Me Too machine where they updated the design slightly and added the card. But really it was a very, very small tweak just to slightly advance the capabilities of the Apple IIe. So 1 year on from the bump that the IIe was given with the Apple IIe Platinum, in September of 1988, Apple released the IIc Plus. This was a new model that had a number of enhancements over the original IIc design. And this was actually a more substantial upgrade than we saw in the Platinum. Firstly, Apple replaced the 5¼ disk drive that you can see in this model here with a new 3.5-inch drive. And this gave its floppy disks a much needed speed and capacity boost. I have to say that I find it a little bit odd that it took Apple 4 years to modify the range to give it a 3.5-inch drive, because if you think about it, the Atari ST and the Amiga came out in 1985, yet it took a number of years before they actually then caught up with that. You know, it took 3 years for them to actually change this drive to the more modern standard. So that seems quite strange to me that they would take so much time to actually get around to doing that. The IIc Plus also got a new version of the 65C02 processor, which now ran at 4 MHz. Now remember, the original one ran at 1 MHz, so we're talking about between 3 to 4 times as fast here. I think it was actually closer to 3. And rather bizarrely, this actually means that the 2C is now faster than the 2GS, which is a 16-bit machine. And I think that hints more strongly at the issue with the 2GS than it really does with the problem with the 2C Plus. This was obviously a big boon to the 2C Plus that it was actually that fast, but it does show that there was something strange going on with the 2GS. Definitely. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Now, because of this new faster processor, you could actually hold down the escape key to boot into a 1 megahertz mode. And the reason why you needed that was because obviously if you were trying to play a game and it was then running at 4 megahertz, it would probably run to, it'd be too fast to actually be playable. So that was pretty good, actually, that they did that. Very similar to what they did with the 2GS. The other change as well was that there was now a power supply which was inside the case of the machine. Despite this, they actually managed to get the machine to be lighter than the original one. And I have to assume that happened because they replaced the 5.25-inch drive with a much smaller 3.5-inch drive. So there must have been quite big weight savings in there, I suppose. And you could argue that this made the machine more portable. I suppose if you had the Apple LCD screen upgrade for it, then it would have been quite a portable machine. You just needed to plug it into wherever you got, and you could put it inside your carry case as you travel back between work and home with it. So the case also had a design refresh. It was very minimal. They actually gave it the same color scheme as the IIe Platinum. Obviously a harmonization there of the sort of design language between machines. And it did also include a couple of tweaks to the keyboard and also the option switches. So all of these changes are welcome, but it's quite a strange story if you think about it. Why did it take Apple 4 years from the original 2C to release an update to it? And, what was going on there? So one rumor says that the 2C Plus, it was actually intended originally to be a next iteration of the 2GS line, a mobile version of it. In the same way that the Apple IIe was turned into the Apple IIc, the engineers at Apple thought it was a good idea to turn the 2GS into a mobile GS. But upper management, accountants, whatever, at Apple didn't think that was a good idea, didn't think it was a viable idea. So the engineering team were obviously champing at the bit to do something with an Apple II. So they decided to pivot and instead increase the capabilities of the 2C. Now that makes a lot more sense to me because if you think about it, the 2GS came out in 1986. And that meant that obviously this project must have been conceived of after 1986. So we're getting much closer now to 1988. And it took some time for them to obviously put together some ideas and put that to the management, and then for that to have cold water poured on. And that makes much more sense. Now you can understand why it took so long for the Apple IIc to get some updates. And the reason why is because they never intended to. This was a change of plan at the last minute to kind of use their creative juices. So yeah, that certainly makes a lot more sense to me. I'm not sure if that rumor is true. Maybe you can comment about this. I've got to say, this is the thing about this machine that's very strange. You now have an 8-bit machine, an Apple II, not a 16-bit machine like the Apple IIgs, that is actually faster than the newer 16-bit machine. I think that definitely indicates some sort of disjointed thinking at Apple, that they would let a version of the machine that wasn't the next generation machine actually be faster than the next generation machine. And it makes you wonder why they didn't actually put that extra effort from the 2C Plus into the 2GS and concentrate their efforts there and really try and push that platform forward. I think there were shenanigans going on behind the scenes at Apple. I really think that someone really did not want the Apple IIgs to succeed. And I think this story actually sort of adds to that evidence a little bit more. And finally, we have one last hurrah for the Apple II in the form of the Apple IIe Card. I know you thought I was going to show you another model of the Apple IIe, but in fact, this was a bit of a strange one, actually. This was actually an expansion card for certain Macintosh computers, and it was released in 1991, which would allow them to then run an Apple IIe inside the machine, so they could then run Apple IIe software, or rather, I should say Apple II software, I suppose. If you remember the Mega 2 chip from the 2GS, well, an evolution of this was then used to produce this card. This would then provide pretty much the same experience as it had inside the 2GS. Except this card also had a 6502 CPU on it, a ROM, and it also had RAM on it as well. It was effectively a complete Apple IIe on a small expansion card that went into, I think it was the processor direct bus slot on a Macintosh LC. And the reason why it needed the extra CPU, ROM, and RAM was because it was now hosted inside what I would describe as a kind of totally alien machine. It was inside a Macintosh, and of course they ran on the 68,000 range of processors from Motorola, so a completely different architecture. So you couldn't use that processor to run an Apple II whatsoever, which is why it necessitated those extra parts. Apple released this product as it did not want to support the now very venerable Apple II in direct competition with its Macintosh range of computers. It felt that a single horse race was preferable for them. The Apple IIe Card, when it's installed in a suitable Macintosh LC, allowed educational establishments and businesses to keep on using their existing Apple II software into the 1990s. Whilst at the same time, it also eased them into Macintosh ownership as they had to buy a Macintosh to actually use the card. Now, the card was actually sold until 1995, which meant it was effectively the last Apple II on sale. This really was actually the swan song for the Apple II series. But it meant, which is quite strange actually when you think about it, that you might feasibly see an Apple IIe in use running on a computer in the early 2000s. But of course, it would have been hosted inside a Mac LC. So a couple of years ago, as I was getting my Apple II computers, I really wanted to get one of these cards. I thought, you know, it would be really cool to have the earlier machines going all the way up to the last machines. What happened during COVID was I came into the possession of a working Macintosh LC. Now, a Macintosh LC is not that great a computer. LC stands for low cost. It's one of the cheaper Macintoshes. However, I did think it would be a really cool machine to have because I could get the card. However, I then had my hopes dashed because I found out that on eBay, the cheapest I could actually get one of these cards was for about £400. The scalpers were in full swing at this point, and a card that really should have been costing £130 was now costing north of £400, and that's just ridiculous. I was not going to pay that price. And today, things haven't improved. In fact, it's actually got worse, and now those cards are actually worth £800. So it looks like my dream of getting an Apple IIe into my Macintosh LC to make that machine a bit more interesting, I think. Doesn't look like it's ever going to happen because I'm never going to get one of those cards. I'm definitely not going to pay £1,000 just for that. It's just ridiculous. So there we are, the Apple IIe Card, a very interesting sort of footnote to the end of the Apple II, really. And this really was the end of the Apple II computer range, but it's also, you know, like I said, it's quite remarkable that in 1995, which is some 18 years after the original Apple II was released, you could still actually go out and buy one of those cards and put an Apple II machine on your desktop. I think that's quite remarkable, and it just goes to show how long-lived this particular machine was. So apart from the Apple IIe Card, what actually happened to the physical machines, the ones which actually still came in cases? Well, the first of these to fall by the wayside was actually the IIc, specifically the IIc Plus model that we just discussed. And the reason for this was this machine had always been less appealing, I suppose, than the Apple IIe model. And that's because obviously it didn't have the expandability. You bought it for what it supplied, and if it didn't have what you needed, it was very difficult to expand it. So I think that always hampered the sales. Of course, the IIc Plus had the extra speed, the faster processor, but it turned out that didn't really help it. It does look like it was a strangely placed product. It looks like it was actually the 2GS that should have been the new model, but for some reason, something happened at Apple and that didn't actually happen. So this machine was produced and it didn't do very well. Apparently it sold maybe something like 40,000 units, which wasn't a great deal. And because of that, it was discontinued in 1990. So yeah, it's a pity really, a bit of a missed opportunity, and maybe they could have done a little bit more with the Apple IIgs. But there we are. You know, there were obviously shenanigans going on at Apple and that didn't happen. So the next machine that was then cancelled, and this is the most bizarre of all, was actually the 2GS. And it fell by the wayside in December of 1991. And I think the reason for this was that, fairly I suppose, the 2GS was seen as a competitor for the Macintosh. Rather than having Apple II users migrating and going on to use Macintoshes, they were still sticking with their old computer. They were using 2GSs. So it was kind of cannibalizing Apple's sales. It was competing against the Macintosh. And that wasn't a good thing, because the Macintosh was fighting a bit of a losing battle really against IBM PCs, because in the early days of PCs, they were kept relatively expensive because IBM controlled them. But over time, as IBM lost control, the clone makers of PCs were in a battle against each other, a battle to the bottom. And as a result of this, the PC's price dropped more and more, and it became more and more price competitive. And it just became a very high-performing machine for a relatively cheap price, and that was very difficult for Apple to compete against. So yeah, Apple decided to stop competing against itself, and unfortunately the loser in that was that the 2GS was discontinued, and that's a shame, because I think it's a great machine, but there we are. So then, just a couple of years later, in fact it was in November of 1993, that it was the Apple IIe Platinum that actually was then removed from sale. And this truly was the end of an era for Apple, because obviously the direct descendant of the original Apple II machine, which by this point was the Apple IIe Platinum, was gone. And I can only imagine the sort of disappointment that there must have been within the Apple II community. But realistically, this was a machine that had sold way beyond its lifespan. It should never really have made it into the 90s, but there we are. It was still on sale at that point. But yeah, 1993, no more Apple II. And this meant that, oddly, the last man standing was the Apple IIe Card, which we just discussed. And that was there really as a sort of Trojan horse to try and get Apple II users to get them into the Macintosh fold. And that's what I actually did. It was there for that purpose, really, for them to carry on using Apple II software on their Macintoshes. And it continued on until 1995, when it was actually discontinued. So, in summing up, what can I say about the Apple II line of computers? Well, on the one hand, they were very important in kickstarting the microcomputing revolution. I have to say that. It was an early, a rather professional machine, I think, quite a professional platform with its slots. And that meant that it lasted a long time. And this gave its users a great deal of stability and a very long lifespan out of their beloved machine, their Apple II. It was, in some ways, unlike any of its initial competition, the PET and the TRS-80, because it was more of an open architecture in the sense that it had the 7 expansion slots inside it. And these went on to allow Apple and also third-party manufacturers to make many different expansion cards. There was a massive ecosystem of expansion cards for this machine. And of course, with these expansion cards, there were also devices, modems and printers and so on and so forth. It was a massive hit in that regard. It had many third parties supporting it. So yeah, it was a very long-lived platform, and it continued over time to grow and provide many more advanced features. I mean, I can imagine that it was, an amazing ride to go from having an Apple II in 1977, which only had 4K of RAM, which seems bizarre really, to an Apple IIe in 1993, which had 128K of RAM. And the sort of era-busting machine around that time, the Commodore 64, only had 64K, and it went on to be an absolutely amazing machine. And it goes to show that, by that point in 1983, you had the Apple II with 128K of RAM. So it was a very capable machine. And yeah, I think that journey must have been amazing. Now, on the flip side, the negative side, I would say that it did kind of set the mold for Apple in terms of pricing. The Apple II was never an affordable machine for most people. When it was released, it sort of hovered around this price its entire life. It was about $6,690 in today's money in 2024. And yeah, this meant this was not a machine that working class people could afford. This is why its early adopters were actually mainly small businesses, I think. And you can see why I think the IBM PC would have targeted the Apple II to try and build a business base when it was released in 1981, because I think this was the machine that was the obvious target. It did have deficiencies in it. And because Apple fumbled, the development of the Apple III and the Lisa and the Macintosh was so slow to take off. I think that's why Apple lost its business crown, I think, to the IBM PC. That was quite unfortunate. So yeah, another thing was, as I just said, the high price. It really did leave the door open to other manufacturers producing a machine that would actually introduce microcomputing to the masses. And I think as a result of its early place in microcomputing, its high, and because of its high price, its impact was really largely limited to mostly North America, in truth. It took until 1979's Apple II Plus before they actually even made a machine that was sold outside of North America. And when it was actually launched in the UK, because of its very high price, it collided with a recession that was actually in full swing here. And money was very tight for a lot of people. And you can imagine that if you said to someone that they would have to spend £7,000, which was actually more money in those, a lot more money in those days compared to dollars, to let little Johnny play games on, that was just never going to happen. People were struggling to eat, let alone buy £7,000 microcomputers. So yeah, that's why really I think the Apple II is much more of a North American phenomenon than anywhere else, I think. Now, of course, it being limited mainly to the United States didn't mean that it didn't have a big impact on computing worldwide. And I think the reason for this is that it pioneered early professionalism, I think, on microcomputers. And I think one of the reasons for that was that it was actually because of the Apple II Disk II system, which made it a relatively professional system to develop on. And because of this, a lot of sort of very early high quality video games were actually developed for the Apple II. And of course, one of the big defining companies of that era, Electronic Arts, was actually founded by Trip Hawkins, and he was actually an employee of Apple. And I think he was a little bit dissatisfied at Apple. Maybe Steve Jobs was ignoring him. And he decided that he was going to strike out and start a company on his own. And one of the things that he actually pioneered when he started Electronic Arts was that he would actually treat the people that wrote video games as artists, hence the name. And he would actually give them credit inside the actual box artwork. And Electronic Arts really did sort of raise the standards of game publishing, along with, I would also say, Infocom. They were a very professional company as well, actually. So yeah, definitely the Apple II was a big place for Electronic Arts. That was where a lot of their early games were developed and published. And so yeah, it was definitely a nursery for early video game development talent, at least in America anyway. So yeah, in this regard, I think the Apple II was definitely groundbreaking. It definitely left a very large legacy. And of course, but not least, it was the computer that actually launched Apple onto the computing landscape. And because of the Apple II, the missteps that Apple made, as I said earlier, making the Apple III, the Lisa, and the slow adoption of the Macintosh, it didn't actually cause the company to go under. And it could have quite easily done that because obviously you can imagine how much money they spent on those machines. The Apple II really was the gift that just kept on giving. And because of that, I'm sure the people at Apple, even to this day, say thanks to Steve, maybe not directly, but by shaking his hand and hopefully giving him a hug, because I think he did an amazing job on the original Apple II. Yeah, I think the Apple II is still a very cool range of computers. It's a machine that I would highly recommend to retro computing enthusiasts worldwide. Everybody everywhere can now get one of these. They're still relatively expensive because generally you have to import them from the US, although you can get machines over in the UK. And obviously, if you want to use one in the UK, you probably want to get a UK model anyway because of the NTSC problems and power supply and so on and so forth. So yeah, mainly it's still easier to collect in the US, but it can be collected overseas. As you can see here, I have a UK Apple IIe, I've got a UK Apple IIc, and I've got a UK Apple IIgs. So it is actually possible. So what's actually the most fun about them? Well, it's what I think was fun about them from the get-go. They are expandable. Well, these two are anyway. And you can customize each of your Apple IIs to some degree and make it as capable a machine as you actually want to. When I bought my own first Apple II machine, the 2 here, the IIe, it actually wasn't that capable. I think it was an earlier model, and I bought various cards I bought the ROMs to make it an enhanced IIe. And yeah, I had a lot of fun buying those things and tinkering with the machine and improving it over the years after that I actually bought it. So yeah, I think it was a great fun machine to get. I think at heart, it's a tinkerer's machine. And I think that's why, you should get one. They're great for tinkering with. So why not get one and have a little tinker yourself? I think they're great machines. So yeah, the Apple II. So yeah, that's it, I think, for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video and obviously the entire series. It was quite a lot of work to put together, as you can imagine. A lot of research, and hopefully I didn't get too many things wrong along the way, because when you're trying to cover an entire series of computers from 1977 all the way up to 1995, it's very, very hard to get every single fact correct. But that's where the comments come in. You can go in the comments and you can comment about what I've said. And if I did make any bloopers, you can obviously correct me there. And obviously, any comments that you want to make on this video or the other 2 videos in this series would be very much welcome. This is a young channel. I've only been going since, what was it, December or something like that of 2023. So it's just about 6 months now. And yeah, it's been a steep learning curve. And I would say this is actually one of the most difficult series that I've put together because of all of the research. But hopefully you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed doing it myself. I did learn some things, and also I remembered some things that I'd forgotten. Because when I bought these machines, I did do a lot of research so that I could buy the right cards, put the right things in different places. And I have to admit, I did make some mistakes and there were some explosions along the way, which I will then probably fix in the future because I'm a little bit more capable at electronics now. I wasn't capable at all back then. I've got a little bit more skill now. So there are actually some peripherals for these machines which I've damaged, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to fix those. And I didn't damage them because I'm a numpty, but because of some design flaws with the Disk 2 system. We'll talk about that in a future video anyway. But yeah, that's it for now. Hopefully if you enjoyed this series and this video in particular, please click on the like button and definitely subscribe if you can, because we really want to see you back here in the future for future videos. We're heading towards the 1,000 subscribers. I'm now at over 600. I've got 400 more to get before I get to the magic number where I actually start to earn money from these videos. And believe me, they're very expensive to make. Not just the purchase price of the computers itself, but also the cameras and all the other paraphernalia that goes along with making these videos. So please help this channel to be a success. Please subscribe. And if you do have any friends as well that are interested in this video or any of our other videos, we do videos on Amigas and things like that, please get them to subscribe as well and help the channel grow. Anyway, that's it for now. I will hope to see you again in future videos. And until then, have a good day. Take care.